To those however, who really love the Union, may I not speak, he said. Lincoln, the anti-slavery constitutionalist, appealed to their conservative constitutionalism. Before entering upon so grave a matter as the destruction of our national fabric, with all its benefits, its memories, and its hopes, would it not be wise to ascertain precisely why we do it? Lincoln explained that the Confederacy would, on its own premise, be reduced to a shambles. They make a precedent, he said, which in turn will divide and ruin them, for a minority of their own will secede from them whenever a majority refuses to be controlled by such a minority. For instance, why may not any portion of a new Confederacy a year or two hence arbitrarily secede again, precisely as portions of the present Union now claim to secede from it? All who cherish disunion sentiments are now being educated to the exact temper of doing this. Secession to Lincoln was mob rule. It was the mob against the Constitution. Plainly, he said, the central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. A majority held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations, and always changing easily with deliberately changes of popular opinions and sentiments, is the only true sovereign of a free people. Whoever rejects it does of necessity fly to anarchy or to despotism. Unanimity is impossible. The rule of a minority as a permanent arrangement is wholly inadmissible. So that rejecting the majority principle, anarchy or despotism in some form, is all that is left.
This program is a video presentation of the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia. Please consider making a monetary gift to support our efforts to bring Civil War history to viewers like you. Visit cwrtdc.org to learn how.
So we all know our speaker, of course, is Sidney Blumenthal, is a journalist and political advisor, probably best known as an assistant and senior advisor to President Bill Clinton and advisor on Hillary Clinton's campaign. Before joining the administration, he had also worked as a political journalist for the New Republic, the Washington Post, and the New Yorker. He's the author of several books, including The Clinton Wars, an 853-page memoir of his time in the White House, The Permanent Campaign, The Rise of the Counter-Establishment, and The Self-Made Man, The Political Life of Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1849. I believe 3 volumes have been published, but there's more to come. He's also served as a consultant for the Robert Altman directed and Gary Trudeau penned HBO series Tanner 88, which tracked a fictional congressman's bid for the Democratic presidential nomination. He also produced the films Max and Taxi Driver to the Dark Side, the latter of which won the Academy Award for the Best Documentary Feature, which I've seen is really good. So it really does give me great pleasure to present Sidney Blumenthal.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here at last. I have some remarks here, and I noted that Carl Sandburg was said to have talked, and I hope not to equal his record, but I'm going to talk a while. And I'm going to move these down here. And I want to thank the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia for inviting me and the Civil War Roundtable. I want to thank Kurt DeSoto and David Kent and Ed Epstein. Thank you very much for making it possible for me to be here. I'm glad that the deep snow is gone. It reminiscent of the deep snow of 1830 and 31 in Illinois, where it started snowing around Christmas time and didn't stop until about this time in February. Lincoln almost got frostbite, was treated, and people still remember it there. So I am in the process of writing volume 4, and I hope I'm near the end this year, of what will be 5 volumes of my Lincoln work. And part of it is what I'm going to talk about tonight. You will be able, at a future date, to read a longer version of it when it's published. But I thought it would be apt at about this time to tell the story of Lincoln's first inaugural. So let's meet Lincoln. This is one group, I should say, and let me address everyone here. That I think is this is one group that really doesn't mind spending some time in the 19th century. So, fellow Lincolnians, let's meet Lincoln the way others did. I'm going to read a while here. After the cannon boomed from the Wigwam in Chicago to celebrate the nomination of Abraham Lincoln as the presidential candidate of the Republican Party, a delegation traveled the next day, May 19th, 1860, to deliver the formal announcement. Lincoln greeted the men at the door of his 2-story frame wooden house on Jackson Street in Springfield and ushered them into his parlor. There, the Republican candidate for the presidency stood, recalled one of the delegates, tall and ungainly in his black suit of apparently new but ill-fitting clothes, his long, tawny neck emerging gauntly from his turned-down collar, his melancholy eyes sunken deep in his haggard face. Most of the members of the committee had never seen him before and gazed at him with surprised curiosity. He certainly did not present the appearance of a statesman, as people usually picture it in their imagination. Now, Lincoln stayed in Springfield for months. He never left after his election, and he was beset by crowds descending on the town of job seekers. But finally, on February 4th, 1861, Lincoln retreated to the isolation of a dingy, dusty, and neglected back room on the 3rd floor of his brother-in-law's general store to begin composing his inaugural address. He asked his law partner, William Herndon, to provide him with copies of Henry Clay's last speech, warning against disunion, in 1850, Andrew Jackson's proclamation against nullification, and Daniel Webster's second reply to Hayne, demolishing John C. Calhoun's states' rights vision of the Constitution. Lincoln had handwritten several drafts of his inaugural address before he brought one he labeled First Edition to the office of the Illinois State Journal newspaper. When it was finished, recalled his private secretary, John Nicolay, the manuscript was entrusted to the publisher of the journal, who, taking a trusty compositor and a case of type, locked himself in a room in the office and remained there until the document was set up, the necessary proofs taken, and the form secure in the office safe until Lincoln could correct and revise the proofs. Perfect secrecy was maintained. Perfect faith was kept. Only the persons authorized knew that the work was done. Lincoln stuffed the proofs into a small, old-fashioned black oilcloth carpet bag, which he gave to his 17-year-old son, Robert, for safekeeping on the journey to Washington without ever telling him its contents. And when Robert nearly forgot it in an Indianapolis hotel, a panicked Lincoln recovered it and kept the bag close to him for the rest of the trip. Early on the morning of February 11th, the day before his 52nd birthday, Lincoln tied his trunks in his room with rope and wrote on note cards that he attached, A. Lincoln, White House, Washington, D.C. He rode in a wagon to the Great Western Railroad Depot. The president-elect took his station in the waiting room, reported the journalist Henry Villard of the New York Herald. Villard, by the way, was a German immigrant who later founded General Electric. And Lincoln allowed his friends to pass by him and take his hand for the last time. His face was pale and quivered with emotion so deep as to render him almost unable to utter a single word. And we all know the speech he delivered to the people he lived with. Here I have lived in Springfield, and he never returned. While Lincoln took his train trip city by city to Washington, the Electoral College would meet at the Capitol to formalize his election. And his election was the very event that had precipitated secession and the crisis. Enter General Winfield Scott, a colossal living monument weighing in at 300 pounds and towering at 6'4" in height. He was indisputably the greatest American soldier since George Washington, the only one to be awarded his titanic rank as Lieutenant General. After Andrew Jackson, Scott was the other great hero of the War of 1812, dubbed Old Fuss and Feathers by his soldiers for his insistence on discipline. He had held the highest command as general-in-chief since the Tyler administration. During the Mexican War, he led a masterly strategic campaign and was instrumental in the diplomacy to conclude the peace. Both Robert E. Lee and Ulysses Grant served under him. Lee was his protege, by the way. Scott had known every president since Jefferson and every other public man on the national stage. He was slighted and befriended by John Quincy Adams, feuded and reconciled with Jackson, engaged in bitter conflict with James K. Polk, and was a rival of Zachary Taylor. Scott had been touted as a Whig presidential candidate since 1840. When he finally gained the nomination in 1852, he conducted a disastrous political campaign, becoming the last of the Whigs. And remember, Lincoln had spent most of his life as a member of the Whig Party, far more than he ever did as a Republican, which is a new party. Scott then became the sworn enemy of the new president, Franklin Pierce, and his Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis. Now, on the eve of the Electoral College count, a Republican Party official worried about its potential disruption at the Capitol, and he came to see General Scott. The general explained his plan. I have said that any man who attempted by force or unparliamentary disorder to obstruct or interfere with the lawful count of the electoral vote for President and Vice President of the United States should be lashed to the muzzle of a 12-pounder and fired out of a window of the Capitol. I would manure the hills of Arlington with fragments of his body, were he a senator or chief magistrate of my native state. And Scott was a Virginian. It is my duty to suppress insurrection, my duty. Scott confided that he had made an agreement with Vice President John C. Breckinridge, who pledged that he would certify the vote. His word is reliable, said Scott. A few drunken rowdies may risk and lose their lives. There will be nothing which deserves the name of a revolution. But no promises relieve me from my duty. While I command the army, there will be no revolution in the city of Washington. On the morning of the count, soldiers were stationed at every entrance to the Capitol. 2 batteries of artillery stood at the north portico. Only those with signed passes were permitted inside. The recording of the votes by the states went quickly. Now it is February 22nd, Washington's birthday, and early in the morning, Lincoln arrives unannounced in Washington after a secret nighttime trip, escaping from an assassination plot in Baltimore discovered by Allan Pinkerton, the private detective. Startling intelligence, sudden departure of Mr. Lincoln for Washington, alleged plot to assassinate him, ran the New York Herald headline. The New York Times reporter, Joseph Howard, provided an indelible picture of Lincoln in disguise. He wore a Scotch plaid hat and a very long military cloak so that he was entirely unrecognizable, reported the New York Times. Unfortunately, these were fabricated details, instantly which defined Lincoln as a figure of ridicule. A host of hostile newspapers piled on the derision. Lincoln was mocked in Vanity Fair, in one illustration dancing in a kilt. In Harper's Weekly, in The Flight of Abraham, he was depicted fleeing with his coattails and his hat feathers flying. Lincoln had eluded the first assassination on his life, but not his character assassination. 23 years later, in 1884, Joseph Howard, the New York Times reporter, confessed he had made up the entire description of Lincoln's absurd garb out of whole cloth. There isn't a word of truth in it, he wrote. I asked myself, what possible disguise could Lincoln get up in? And I imagined him in a Scotch cap, and instead of a silk hat, I put that on his head, and then a military cloak. The trimmings were pure imagination. Now, as it happened, Joseph Howard, the Times reporter, was briefly imprisoned in 1864 for contriving another utterly false story after forging the signatures of Lincoln and Seward on what became known as the bogus proclamation for a new draft of 400,000 men in order to spike up the price of gold in which he had speculated. Now, enter William Henry Seward, the senator from New York, the former governor of New York, the best-known Republican in the country, appointed by Lincoln as Secretary of State, and believed generally to be the real power in the coming administration, called the Premier. Seward met Lincoln at the Washington train station, attaching himself to Lincoln as his guide, his minder, and his advisor, barely letting him out of his sight. Seward barely disguised his disappointment and resentment when an ungrateful party, as he said, gave the nomination to a prairie statesman and country lawyer of Illinois. In retrospect, Seward came to regret not taking the nomination in 1856, the first Republican candidacy, when he could have had it for the asking, though he certainly would have lost, and blamed his political alter ego and Republican New York power broker Thurlow Weed for persuading him to wait until 1860, when it seemed he would certainly win it. When the two men were driving past Union Square in New York after the dedication of the Lincoln statue there in 1870, Seward remarked, "If it hadn't been for you, Weed, I would be up on that pedestal instead of Abraham Lincoln." Throughout January and February, Seward tinkered in Washington on changeable proposals day after day, telling Republicans he was holding firm against compromise with the secessionists and others that he was working out the compromise. Seward believed that Lincoln's election had made the issue that had carried him to victory, to the presidency, the extension of slavery in the territories, a thing of the past. Now, according to Seward, the pressing issue was preservation of the Union. Seward also thought that the Republican Party was barely a party, but a conglomeration of ill-sorted factions that should be superseded by another party, a new Union Party to gather all the Unionists, East and West, North and South, something like a reconstituted Whig Party before its crack-up. The Republican Party, thought Seward, had served its purpose, and it had failed in its mission, especially to nominate William Henry Seward. Lincoln, however, believed his election proved the centrality of the party and the necessity of coalition building. Seward confided his strategy to be directed by himself as the real head of state behind the scenes, the premier, to Lord Richard Lyons, the British ambassador. His plan, he insisted, would lead in short order to the collapse of the Confederacy. Lyons wrote in a memo on February 4th to Lord John Russell, the British Foreign Secretary, "Mr. Seward's real view of the state of the country appears to be that if bloodshed can be avoided until the new government is installed, the seceding states will in no long time return in the Confederation." It was quite a grand illusion. Seward worked all day on February 24th. I believe today is the 25th, so almost the anniversary of this, editing Lincoln's inaugural draft. He numbered every line of its 7 pages to enumerate his 49 suggested changes. I have suggested many changes of little importance severally, but in their general effect, tending to soothe the public mind, he wrote Lincoln. Lincoln's original draft was a straightforward and tightly constructed argument. He would honor the pledge on which he won the election to prohibit the extension of slavery. He would not interfere with slavery in the southern states. He would declare that secession was unconstitutional. He would not compromise his mandate and duty. The majority, he said, must prevail, and he would put the responsibility for any civil war on the secessionists. But the defects of the draft were its lack of subtlety, its defensive and confrontational tone, and the absence of a memorable phrase. Seward, for his own purposes, provided or provoked certain missing elements. Seward softened the speech's tone wherever he could. His major influence was in altering its opening and its close. Now, Lincoln's original conclusion ended with a threat. "With you and not with me is the solemn question of, shall it be peace or a sword?" This line was a biblical quotation from Matthew 10:34, in which Jesus says, "Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword." This is not the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount. Lincoln had paraphrased the Gospels for his own use many times before. In his 1858 speech announcing his Senate candidacy in Illinois, he reworked lines from Mark and Luke, and he said, "A house divided cannot stand half slave and half free." His offer of peace or a sword was the logical unfolding of the house divided. Seward suggested that Lincoln drop this line and substitute a broad appeal to patriotic feeling, and Seward composed a very windy sentence and ending. And here's Seward's version. I close. We must not be aliens or enemies, but fellow countrymen and brethren. Although passion has strained our bonds of affection, too heartily they must not, I am sure they will not be broken. The mystic chords, which proceeding from so many battlefields and so many patriot graves, pass through all the hearts and all the hearths in this broad continent of ours, will yet again harmonize in their ancient music when breathed upon by the guardian angel of the nation. Seward's final trope was lifted from his January 12th speech before the Senate, urging his now forgotten compromise. When once the guardian angel has taken flight, everything is lost. Lincoln took Seward's closing under advisement. On New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1860, General Scott summoned his aide, Captain Charles P. Stone, to join him for dinner. After recalling stories about the Mexican War, Scott got to the point. How was the feeling in the District of Columbia? What proportion of the population would sustain the government by force if necessary? Scott stalked around the room silently before heading out to his carriage, and he said to his aide, "These people have no rallying point. Make yourself that rallying point," he ordered. And with that, Scott promoted Stone to colonel and ordered him to defend the Capitol during the inauguration. It's March 3rd, the day before the inauguration. Stone met with Scott to confirm the final plan. 8 regular infantry companies had arrived in the Capitol, as well as cavalry and artillery. A double file of a cavalry squadron would accompany the presidential carriage, followed by infantrymen. Along Pennsylvania Avenue, Stone stationed sharpshooters on the rooftops. On the east of the Capitol, he placed an artillery battery. He received information from detectives on the night of March 3rd that there would be an assassination attempt on Lincoln by blowing up the platform where he would take the oath of office. Stone moved a battalion of troops to the stairs of the Capitol. The windows bristled with riflemen. He deployed a small army of undercover detectives to meld into the crowd, to observe anyone who might act suspiciously. "Don't let your wife come to my inauguration," Lincoln remarked to a friend, a Republican editor from Wisconsin. "It is best for our women to remain indoors on that day, as the bullets may be flying." Lincoln rose at 5 a.m. on the 4th, Inauguration Day, ate breakfast, and directed his son Robert to read his inaugural address aloud to him. Seward arrived to check that the conciliatory portions of the speech were still there. Lincoln dressed in his new suit, a black dress coat, black vest, black pants, black silk hat. He carried a huge ebony cane with a gold head the size of an egg. A cold, brief rain shower stopped at 8 a.m. The gray skies opened to the sun. President James Buchanan's carriage left the White House at noon, drove 2 blocks to Willard's Hotel to pick up Lincoln, where he was staying. As they drove up Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol, Buchanan remarked to him, "If you are as happy in entering the White House as I shall feel on returning to my home, you are a happy man indeed." The pageant reached the Capitol at 1 o'clock. Then Buchanan and Lincoln walked in, the former pale, sad, nervous, the latter's face slightly flushed with compressed lips, reported the New York Times. Mr. Buchanan sighed audibly and frequently, but whether from reflection upon the failure of his administration, I can't say, wrote the reporter. Mr. Lincoln was grave and impassive as an Indian martyr. And then they followed a procession of dignitaries outside to the East Portico. The seating was unassigned, and everyone ran for chairs. Behind them loomed the dome of the Capitol, still under construction. Originally built in 1825 out of wood and copper, it had rotted, and a magnificent cast iron dome started in 1855 was mostly unfinished. Lincoln held onto his cane and hat. He stood before the small table where he laid the pages of his speech. It was a gusty day. He leaned the cane against the table to hold the pages, but he did not know where to put his hat. Senator Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln's longtime rival, who had seated himself in the front row, reached to hold it. "If I cannot be president," Douglas said to Lincoln, "I can at least be his hat bearer." "Fellow citizens of the United States," Lincoln began. His opening sought to reassure the South that there is no special anxiety or excitement and has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. He promised, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists." None of this was new. He had made this promise many times in the preceding months. But he explained he had come into office under great and peculiar difficulty. A disruption of the federal union heretofore only menaced is now formidably attempted. He launched into his argument to the jury, who were the people, public opinion itself, step by logical step, laying out his case. "I hold that in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, the union of these states is perpetual. Perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments. It is safe to assert that no government proper ever had a provision in its organic law for its own termination. The federal government will endure forever, it being impossible to destroy it except by some action not provided for in the instrument itself." The Constitution, said Lincoln, was not a compact among the states that could be dissolved like a mere contract. Again, if the United States be not a government proper, but an association of states in the nature of contract merely, can it, as a contract, be peaceably unmade by less than all the parties who made it? One party to a contract may violate it, break it, so to speak, but does it not require all to lawfully rescind it? He appealed to history as his authority. The Union is much older than the Constitution. It was formed, in fact, by the Articles of Association in 1774. It was matured and continued by the Declaration of Independence in 1776. It was further matured, and the faith of all the then 13 states expressed, plighted, and engaged that it should be perpetual by the Articles of Confederation in 1778. And finally, in 1787, one of the declared objects for ordaining and establishing the Constitution was to form a more perfect union. From his tightly packed history flowed his case against secession as insurrection. But, Lincoln went on, if destruction of the Union by one or by a part only of the states being lawfully possible, the Union is less perfect than before the Constitution, having lost the vital element of perpetuity. It follows from these views that no state, upon its own mere motion, can lawfully get out of the Union, that resolves and ordinances to that effect are legally void, and that acts of violence within any state or states against the authority of the United States are insurrectionary or revolutionary. It followed, according to Lincoln, that the Union is unbroken and that it was his simple duty to constitutionally defend and maintain it. Throughout his political career, Lincoln had taken the speeches of Stephen A. Douglas as his basic texts to deconstruct in shaping his own philosophy. But Lincoln did not have Douglas anymore as his opponent. Lincoln, the lawyer, focused in his inaugural address for the first time on the words of a new adversary. Lincoln's refutation of the compact theory of the Constitution was his rhetorical thrust against Jefferson Davis, who in his inaugural address as president of the Confederacy had called the Constitution, quote, perverted. That brought Lincoln to the quandary he faced over beleaguered Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. There needs to be no bloodshed or violence, he said, and there shall be none unless it be forced upon the national authority. He stated his principle first. The power confided to me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government and to collect the duties and imposts. But beyond what may be necessary for these objects, there will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere. The true policy of the government, the New York Times described it, is unquestionably that of masterly inactivity. In Seward's scenario, the Upper South would remain intact within the Union if there were no conflict, and the Confederacy would gradually fall of its own weight. Yet the Confederacy had already seized control throughout the South of the forts, armories, courthouses, and other federal property. Lincoln next adopted the rhetorical advice of speaking to a particular group that happened not to be physically present. To those who seek to destroy the Union at all events and are glad of any pretext to do it, I will neither affirm or deny, but if there be such, I need address no word to them. Instead, he spoke to the Unionists, Southern Unionists, usually the members of the Constitutional Unionist Party that had carried the border states in the 1860 election, a long-lost tribe of Southern Whigs. To those who, however, who really love the Union, may I not speak, he said. Lincoln, the anti-slavery constitutionalist, appealed to their conservative constitutionalism. Before entering upon so grave a matter as the destruction of our national fabric, with all its benefits, its memories and its hopes, would it not be wise to ascertain precisely why we do it? Lincoln explained that the Confederacy would, on its own premise, be reduced to a shambles. They make a precedent, he said, which in turn will divide and ruin them, for a minority of their own will secede from them whenever a majority refuses to be controlled by such a minority. For instance, why may not any portion of a new Confederacy a year or two hence arbitrarily secede again, precisely as portions of the present Union now claim to secede from it. All who cherish disunion sentiments are now being educated to the exact temper of doing this. Secession to Lincoln was mob rule. It was the mob against the Constitution. Plainly, he said, the central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. A majority held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations, and always changing easily with deliberately changes of popular opinions and sentiments, is the only true sovereign of a free people. Whoever rejects it does of necessity fly to anarchy or to despotism. Unanimity is impossible. The rule of a minority as a permanent arrangement is wholly inadmissible, so that rejecting the majority principle, anarchy or despotism in some form, is all that is left. At last, Lincoln came to the heart of the matter. One section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended. This is the only substantial dispute. He suggested that where the moral sense of the people imperfectly supports the law itself, such as the Fugitive Slave Act, they could abide by the dry legal obligation. But the debate was no longer reducible to that law or any other. The events of the last year, the crack-up of the Democratic Party, Lincoln's election, and the creation of the Confederacy could not be reeled backwards. Lincoln could not be unelected, nor would the Confederacy dissolve itself under the promise that Northerners would still obey the Fugitive Slave Act, even if grudgingly. Lincoln tried another argument. Physically speaking, we cannot separate. We cannot remove our respective sections from each other, nor build an impassable wall between them. A husband and wife may be divorced and go out of the presence and beyond the reach of each other, but the different parts of our country cannot do this. His description of the geographical inseparability of the country was indisputable, but this fact did not pose a middle course, but rather the question of either recognition of or conflict with the Confederacy, because, after all, who would control the Mississippi River and its outlet to the sea? Lincoln tried yet another approach, another plea. He suggested that peace could be achieved if he were considered just a mere passing phenomenon. He diminished himself. While the people retain their virtue and vigilance, no administration by any extreme of wickedness or folly can very seriously injure the government in the short space of 4 years. Lincoln urged patience, calm, and a spirit of compromise in the atmosphere of crisis, tension, and conflict. My countrymen, one and all, think calmly and well upon this whole subject. Nothing valuable can be lost by taking time. If there be an object to hurry any of you in hot haste to a step which you would never take deliberately, that object will be frustrated by taking time, but no good object can be frustrated by it. Such of you as are now dissatisfied still have the old Constitution unimpaired, and on the sensitive point, the laws of your own framing under it, while the new administration will have no immediate power, if it would, to change either. Twice he repeated the phrase taking time. He pledged to uphold the old Constitution, as if he were the candidate of the Constitutional Unionist Party, whose slogan was "The Constitution as it is, the Constitution as it was." Then, suddenly, Lincoln took a turn. He was no longer speaking to the Southern Unionists, to the wavering, the undecided. He directly addressed the secessionists, whom he had said it was pointless to attempt to persuade. But he was not trying to convert them. He tried to forestall them. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressor. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. For the first and only time in his speech, Lincoln used the words Civil War. He put the entire burden of starting it on the Confederate leadership. He now warned that he would regard aggression as an act of war. He would defend the government. This was his substitute of the biblical injunction he had excised in his first draft of Peace or a Sword. However, Lincoln could not grant the Confederates the only concession they sought, which was recognition. He could not concede, as he called it, to anarchy and despotism. Peace was up to the Confederates. And now Lincoln came to his ending. He had taken Seward's version and made it his own. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living hearth and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Chief Justice Roger Taney, the author of the Dred Scott decision that declared no black man had any right the white man was bound to respect, and had done so much to divide the country, stood, shook Lincoln's hand, and administered the oath of office. The tone is as conciliatory as possible, wrote Edward Everett in his diary the evening of the inauguration. Edward Everett was perhaps the representative man of conservatism in his time. He was the former everything, the former Secretary of State, the former governor of Massachusetts, the former president of Harvard, the former vice presidential candidate on the Constitutional Unionist ticket. And he would be the future speaker, preceding Lincoln at the dedication of the cemetery at Gettysburg. But now Everett pointed to the obvious contradiction. But the intention is intimated of holding the forts and collecting the duties in the ports of the seceded states. Either measure will result in civil war, which I am impelled to look upon as almost certain. On the morning of the inauguration, James Buchanan gathered his cabinet for a last meeting while he signed his final batch of bills. Just before he was to depart to pick up Lincoln to travel to the Capitol, Joseph Holt, the Secretary of War, burst in, according to Buchanan, waving extraordinary dispatches from Major Robert Anderson, who was in charge in Fort Sumter, saying that without a force of some 20 or 30,000 men to capture the batteries which had been erected against the fort, he could not maintain himself. Buchanan remarked, it was now a matter for the new administration. On his carriage ride with Lincoln, he said nothing to him about Anderson's frantic message. He washed his hands of the whole matter. Lincoln's strategy to hold the forts indefinitely, but to avoid any action that might trigger conflict, lasted exactly one day into his presidency. The day after his inauguration, on the morning of March 5th, After all the parties, Joseph Holt, now the interim Secretary of War, deposited Major Anderson's report at the White House for Lincoln to discover with a cover note reading the declaration now made by the Major that he would not be willing to risk his reputation on an attempt to throw reinforcements into Charleston Harbor with a view of holding possession of the same force of less than 20,000 good and well-disciplined men takes the department by surprise, as his previous correspondence contains no such estimation. Holt included remarks from General Scott. When Major Anderson, wrote the general, first threw himself into Fort Sumter, it would have been easy to reinforce him. But in light of the great change of circumstances, there was no alternative but a surrender. And so began Lincoln's crisis over Fort Sumter. And as we all know, after intense consultations, Lincoln decided to provision and reinforce the fort. Jefferson Davis ordered its bombardment in the early hours, April 12th. As Lincoln would say in his second inaugural address, and the war came. I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me, Lincoln said later. And in the spring of 1861, the events came in a rush. The attack on Union troops passing through Baltimore, the first dead in the war on its streets, the isolation and virtual siege of Washington, the early mobilizations of the Union Army, and of the public. And here, Lincoln's voice was central. Lincoln defined the meaning of the war, finally, in his first message to the Congress. This was Lincoln's first explanation of the war's purpose. This was, of course, before the Emancipation Proclamation, and this remained Lincoln's fundamental understanding throughout. And this is what he said. This is what Lincoln said. This is essentially a people's contest. On the side of the Union, it is a struggle for maintaining in the world that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life, yielding to partial and temporary departures from necessity. This is the leading object of the government for whose existence we contend. Abraham Lincoln, July 4th, 1861. Thank you.
It was wonderful.
Great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks for coming. We
Thank
have
you.
time for questions? Are we out of time? Do
Yeah,
Okay, that's great.
we have time for questions or are we?
sure.
I'd like to ask the question
Yes,
that
sir.
everyone wants to answer to. When can we expect volume 4? And can we host a book premiere party and a signing for you?
Ah, what a generous offer. Thank you. If anything will spur me to finish, it's that. I'm working every day, and I am sure I will finish this volume this year, and that it will be published next year, and that there will then be another volume after that. I'm hesitant to give up Lincoln, and I prefer to spend every day with him, but I have to finish these books.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask you, what was the most surprising thing you learned as you did all your research?
That's a really interesting question. I learned surprises all the way along as I work. And what I learn is how Lincoln thinks carefully through every instant he's in and how he weighs things. He's somebody who learned self-control. He learned self-discipline, and he had learned the law and thought like a lawyer. He stayed up late at night on the circuit in Central Illinois while everyone else was asleep, reading Euclid so he could learn logic better. And he assimilated all that. And he always paid attention to, as I noted, what his opponents were saying. And he studied them. And he would always frame his arguments not only to refute their arguments and get inside them, but with the jury in mind. And he always had a sense of what the people were. And his years and years spent with plain people out in Central Illinois and his whole life schooled him in how to speak accessibly so that people understood what he was saying at the same time he was making a logical argument. So that's one of the insights that I gained, and that is really a part of the heart of Lincoln's politics and how he conducted politics. And that's in addition to being a student of human nature. And he saw every kind of human being that there was. And he was, by the way, one of the world's greatest experts on con men. From his youngest age to his friendship with P.T. Barnum, to even bringing Barnum and a midget to a cabinet meeting. So, and I could go on, but the other thing that I've learned, a central thing, it's not like a surprising fact, was that Lincoln always rooted his politics in the Constitution. And he did this naturally. It was very much of its time, but it was the most powerful politics. And needless to say, it's a lesson that people today could learn from.
Sidney, in reading Lincoln's message to Congress of July 1861, are you saying that Lincoln was implicitly, if not explicitly, because of course he couldn't at the time, he was implicitly saying that emancipation would be the goal of the Union in the Civil War?
At what time during this speech?
In July of 1861, where he talks about lifting the burden from all men, that all men should have an equal chance in the race of life.
Yeah. Lincoln, and by the way, this is to those who don't know Jeffrey Boutwell, I commend to everyone here his book on his distant relative. And it's a really indispensable volume that fills a gap in Civil War literature. Lincoln was not at that time, urging emancipation at all. And however, in that message to Congress, there's a clue of what he had in mind, because he uses the word unfettered. And everyone understood that unfettered referred to chains, which referred to slavery. Lincoln, of course, had made many anti-slavery statements, many eloquent statements about slavery, but he was disciplining himself not to do that in the war early on, when the war was disorganized and after Bull Run going very badly. This speech was followed by later that month by the Battle of Bull Run, which was a catastrophe. And what people thought would end with one large battle was not. It was to go on. Lincoln, however, comes to the idea of emancipation and had held it much earlier than people think. So, and he had planned for compensated emancipation to be done by the border states, and proposed that on March 6 of 1862. None of the border states took it up. Lincoln was sort of reduced to the Emancipation Proclamation by all the other means failing, which he thought were stronger and more permanent rather than an executive order. So, and the whole story of Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation is another saga.
Do you have any questions online?
The only comment is how appropriate is for this time, how germane all of this is.
I wanted to ask you,
Please, Ed.
in your talk, you mentioned Buchanan's incompetence or his willful disregard for the problem and gets got out of town. Did Lincoln ever comment about Buchanan and his performance as president?
No, not that I mean, he was, at one point, he, in the transition, he privately commented that if Buchanan had made a statement in December of 1860, a presidential statement, that secession was wrong, but that the president had no powers to stop it. And it was one of the, arguably, we've had a long history, but it was certainly one of the worst statements ever made by a president, most disastrous. And Lincoln said, well, if he says that, he should be hanged. But it was a private statement.
Thank you very much, Sidney. I appreciate it.
Thank you all for hearing me and inviting me. Thank you.